Hello, I'm Susan Carew. Nice to see you all. My question is of a spiritual nature, actually. I'd like to know your comment of whether you're aware of a spiritual evolution taking place, and if so, what does it look like to you?
There we are. Well, that's a question that probably has lots and lots of different answers depending on who you ask. You'd have to really define the terms. So when I think in terms of spiritual evolution, I think in terms of things like becoming more inclusive and recognizing more of the common humanity and taking an approach that includes not just hard-bitten commercial interests, but something more broad than that. Unfortunately, an awful lot of those things are characteristic of expansionary times when the trust horizon is expanding as well. That's when people tend to be more inclusive, to look for common humanity, to accept more people who are different from them. And so, unfortunately, I think we're about to see a shift that is going to take us in a less productive direction with regard to those particular parameters, because the psychology of contraction is more characterized by an us versus them dynamic, where us becomes more and more tightly defined and them becomes a more pejorative term. So unfortunately, you tend to get, say, political aggregation, shrinking, more of a kind of tribalism, if you like, where you build a lot of very intense relationships within a group that self-identify as a group. But between groups, things are rockier than they were before. If people don't see themselves as being similar, if they're looking more for differences than similarities, then that tends to manifest itself in contractionary times. So if we assume that human nature is naturally all good, and that it's therefore going to take us in a better and better direction, and we'll all at a global level just cope with all of this, I think that's unfortunately not very, very likely to happen. If you look at the people who've described human nature in the past, I mean, there are all sorts of different positions, and you think, how could they possibly have come up with ideas as divergent as in fact they have, even if you just look at how they describe the fundamental aspects of human nature. But if you superimpose what they wrote with when they wrote it, then you can really see that the people who were very optimistic about human nature were writing in expansionary times, and the people who were very pessimistic were writing in very strongly contractionary times. So I think we do have to bear in mind that the kind of circumstances we're moving into are going to mean that we're kind of moving into a headwind in terms of collective psychology. And what we need to try and do is carve out and maintain that positive space. But we're going to be having to do it actively, pushing back against the spread of something less constructive that will get traction in difficult times, unfortunately. And we have been able to connect a lot of people with technology, and over the years of our expansion that's led to the internet and all the social media. All of these things have their uses, and we really have built cells of interesting things going on where people are getting to know what other people are doing, and all of this has been wonderful. I'm just not convinced that it's necessarily going to be maintained in the way that we might hope. I think a lot of collective things, social media, are going to be inconvenient for the powers that be at some point, because the last thing they want is people organizing and coming together. So I think a lot of these things will come under attack, and we're already seeing that in the States. There's a lot of internet control legislation that's being brought in that is going to make it harder for people to engage on that level. And this is, of course, what governments around the rest of the world have done. Whenever there's a period of upheaval, they shut down Facebook and Twitter and things like that. And they make it harder for people to communicate with each other rather than easier. So I think some of the sort of evolutionary aspects that you're talking about are really characteristic of the expansionary period. And I would very much like to see that dynamic continue, but I really don't think it will unless we fight for every inch of it all along the way, because of that headwind of the psychology of contraction and where that is taking us in difficult economic times.
Hello, much more financial question. With compulsory superannuation in Australia, have you got any advice on when we do have control over where that can be invested, what sorts of things we should be doing?
Well, I'm not an expert on Australian tax laws, so there are going to be things that would be possible that I wouldn't have any way of knowing about. Now, what I do understand is that people tell me it's much harder to get anything out. You would practically have to be starving to death to get anything out in advance, and that is unfortunate. So it's less flexible as a system than in many other parts of the world. I don't believe you can't pay off your mortgage with it or anything like that, but someone who was at a talk I did in Melbourne had done a lot of research into this. I'm trying to get him to write it all up for the Automatic Earth. But one of the things that he mentioned was, although you can't pay off your mortgage, you can pay off somebody else's, because then it's a property investment and you're being an engine of credit expansion in theory. So if you can pay off someone else's mortgage and they can pay off yours, then you can achieve the same effect. So there are some kinds of flexibility, but I wouldn't know the full range of what is possible to do with it. But pension funds will be acutely vulnerable. They're sitting ducks. They're thoroughly invested in the system, thoroughly exposed to the solvency of middlemen. So especially for younger people, the odds of anything whatsoever being there by the time you get to 65 are really, really low. So it will be a question of trying to figure out how to be able to get something out of that system. You can do a self-managed super fund, but I don't know the costs of doing that. So it's hard to know whether to recommend that in anybody's specific circumstances, because it's going to depend how much is there that you're trying to protect versus what is the cost of moving into a self-managed fund, and what additional flexibility would you gain if you did that. I think you have to be in a self-managed fund in order to be able to do the pay each other's mortgages off thing. But there will be probably different funds with different kinds of structures depending on whether it's a government fund or whether it's private. So it's going to be a question of some serious research on the costs of trying to be self-managed, the flexibility you gain in doing so, and then the kinds of things you could use that flexibility for.
For all those people who've been, Nicole, I've had this constant stream down the back here of people saying, no, you can't do that, but you can do this. And yet this is an open space discussion thing that we need to have with people who've already been looking into it in the Australian context. So please, someone put that up as a discussion point for open space.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you very much for your talk. It's made me make some sense of my life. And I'm really grateful for that. 2 years ago, I decided my life was going to be about living an extraordinary life, where all aspects of my life coexist, and I'm going to do it with ease and grace. Arrived at 7 pillars, and I've been implementing that every day. And at the end of 2 years, I actually do find myself completely debt-free. When I was going through the journey, I decided to give my house back to the bank, and we sold it together and stuff. So the question I have, and I've also been a movie producer, so the question I have is this, that as an independent movie producer, there is a rise of us. The distribution network, which is what gets our movies seen, is still very set in the old ways. So it's very hard for movies that actually are movies that a lot of us want to see. They aren't actually being seen by anybody. Anything that you've seen anywhere else that we should be looking at to have our movies be seen?
It's very, very difficult when you're trying to work through an established system where all the rules favor the bigger players. Usually the only way to do things is to build your own system, rather than try to break into the top-down system that's going to be pretty impervious to independence, unless you can get some backing, of course. So I don't mean necessarily financial backing, but you may be able to produce something that you can convince someone with a lot of clout to recommend. And if you can start getting recommendations like that, you might be able to break into the larger distribution system. Otherwise, it may be a question of doing a lot of legwork yourself to have your own little distribution company. And if you can set yourself up as your own little company, then you get taken more seriously as a company when you're looking at the people who would actually show films or do screenings. You can set it up, it can be quite small. It can be a bit like, you know, self-publishing written work. So I know a number of people who have their own little publishing company because they wanted to self-publish and be able to get some foothold into the distribution network. But it does mean a lot more work. It means a lot more actually going places and talking to people and negotiating one at a time, because you don't end up with somebody to do that for you the way the big players would. But it can be very useful to have that independent approach, because then you're not having to play their game, and the costs of playing their game can be quite high. If you're doing it yourself, you can keep much better control of the costs. So you shell out less money, but at the expense of walking a lot more miles and talking to a lot more people as you do things yourself. So you would have to decide whether you think going for clout and trying to get into the bigger system will make sense for you, or whether you can do it small and cheap and independent. But either one of those may be possible.
Is it on? Hi, Nicole. I've got 3 questions. So, maybe can I ask them and then she can just decide which one she wants to answer? Okay then. So, what do you think of the current Occupy movement going on around the world? Do you think it has much purpose, and is it effective or helpful in the long term of what you've been talking about?
It's an interesting one, because right now they are very much they are interested in the issues of the financial system and the abuses that have occurred and the corruption. My worry is that it's a somewhat unfocused movement, so they don't necessarily understand the ins and outs of the system that they're protesting against, and they tend to cast it as if it's a fault of a few bad apples rather than a systemic, long-standing crisis. So my worry is that the leadership of Occupy, such as it is, it's not a very leader-led movement, but the leadership such as it is not as well informed as to exactly what they're facing as one would ideally want to see. I think it's definitely worth talking to them and helping them to gain that deeper appreciation, because the better informed you are as to exactly what you're facing, the more effective you can be in achieving your goals. So if they stay a somewhat vague, slightly unfocused, leaderless movement, then my worry is that they may start being about justice and end up being about revenge. So that could take them from where they currently are, which is a positive force, I would argue, to some there that would make them more of a negative force. And right now they're not doing that, but my worry is that when times get hard, that is the natural direction for movements like that to go, because there is going to be a lot of anger. There already is a lot of anger in that system. And I think when you start to add the fear element as well, then you could find that you have a mass movement that gets a whole lot of traction really, really quickly, that could end up taking you in a direction that you would never have thought it would. People who are angry and afraid, unfortunately, are all too subject to manipulation by populists with really simplistic answers to things. So, especially if you have a somewhat simplistic understanding of the problem, someone can come along and offer a simplistic answer and make it sound plausible, and people can end up giving their support to unfortunate political choices, shall we say. It's one of the tools that people who would like to be demagogues tend to use, is to provide simplistic answers to unfocused movements of anger and fear and take them in very dangerous directions. You know, I worry in the American context, I worry about fascist theocracy, there are an awful lot of people who would choose to take a country in that direction and blame some segment of society, whether it's environmentalists or Iranians or gay people or feminists or liberals or whatever it might be. My worry is that certain segments of society are going to be identified as the enemy, and there just tends to be the potential for really nasty scapegoating under those kinds of circumstances. So I think I would provide qualified support to Occupy at this point, as long as they stay being a force for trying to do things differently and trying to build decentralization, then I would be happy to support them. If they start becoming more about anger and fear and susceptible to manipulation by demagogues, then I would not support that at all. So it's a qualified support at the moment, subject to what direction they end up going over the next few years.
Folks, don't forget with your questions that Nicole will be here for the open space this afternoon, and we might even be able to convince her to head off for dinner and a drink afterwards. So don't despair if you're not going to get on the list.
Hi, Nicole. I just want to ask, currently a lot of the solutions around energy and climate change demand centralised government. Like we've got the carbon tax and sort of a lot of planning for big energy infrastructure projects. What role do you see, or how do you see that sort of current optimistic view fitting in with the kind of longer term transition to decentralisation?
Very good question. I think those initiatives are basically extrapolating current trends forward. We've had increasing centralization, an increasing view towards centralized solutions, defining problems in global terms, addressing them at a global level. I think that is basically where we have come from. I don't think it's where we're going. I think large-scale initiatives like that are not going to be effective because they're coming from the top down. They're going to be beyond the trust horizon. Institutions under those circumstances don't work very well. So I think those kind of supposed solutions to global problems are really not going to be anywhere near as effective as people think. Now, with climate, I tend not to frame my arguments in climate terms, not because I don't think climate change is important, obviously it is, but if you frame something as a global problem and you start looking at really large top-down solutions as a result, from the point of view of ordinary people, that's a very disempowering approach to take. People are not very likely to actually do anything if something is framed at a gargantuan scale and they don't feel that anything they can do is really going to make any real difference. If they feel the whole thing has been handed over to a higher level of organization, it disempowers people. It breeds complacency, and there's always the sense that, oh, somebody else can do something about it. I'm just enjoying my carbon-intensive lifestyle, or whatever it might be. But a lot of the things that I would recommend to people to do for the sake of financial crisis or peak oil would also have beneficial effects in climate terms. But because they are framed at a much more personal, much more immediate level, people are far more likely to actually do something. And so what I'm trying to do is get people to do things in the ways that I think are most likely to have an effect. And if we can actually benefit the climate in doing so, I think that's very much a good thing. However, there are issues with climate that even if we do reduce CO2 emissions, CO2 has a very long residence time in the atmosphere. So just because we reduce emissions, which we inevitably will when there's less economic activity, just because we reduce emissions doesn't mean CO2 levels in the atmosphere are going to fall anytime soon. So that is going to be a problem. So we are going to be still in the danger zone with regard to climate for a while. In fact, one of the issues that we may be facing is that particulate matter does change very quickly. When your emissions go down, the amount of particulate matter you put into the air does fall, and the level of that falls very quickly. So particulate matter in the atmosphere has been causing something called global dimming. So there's a layer of particulate matter in the atmosphere that screens out, bounces back a certain amount of solar radiation. So if CO2 levels stay high and particulate matter falls so that you reduce that global dimming effect, you could actually find that climate change gets worse going forward, because you could end up realizing that global dimming has been shielding us from the worst effects of global warming. There are some question marks, though. Well, the models don't incorporate financial crisis or peak oil. So I think that we really need to do some climate modeling that does incorporate what is likely to happen under those circumstances. Less economic activity, but maybe people go cut down trees. Some places in the world, people will probably burn old tires for heat if they have to. And there are all sorts of things that might happen. You know, if people are cutting down trees, that's impacting on carrying capacity. So there are a whole lot of things that aren't factored into the models. We don't really know where we stand with regard to the feedback loops involved in climate change. We know they're out there, but we don't know whether we've hit tipping points with regard to, say, the methane emissions from Siberian permafrost or from methane clathrates on the bottom of the ocean. So there are a number of feedback loops out there that we're flirting with, but we don't know if we've passed the critical point. There might even be, arguably or plausibly, a feedback loop in the other direction, where if you increase evaporation enormously, you might increase precipitation over the poles. You could actually start to rebuild the mass of ice and increase albedo and things reflecting sunlight back into space. So we don't know what the net effect of those feedback loops is. We also don't know where our anthropogenic global warming lies in the cycle of natural forcings, which undoubtedly exists. We really don't understand the cycle of natural forcings at all. The longer term cycles of sunspot activity and things, we know that these natural forcings exist if we look over history, where there have been major climate fluctuations long before we were pumping industrial CO2 into the atmosphere. So again, it's a net effect kind of question. It's where is the net impact of all these different factors driving things in one direction or another. So I think there's plenty of scope for research in climate change to try and provide a much more complete picture of where we're going. And the greater the extent to which we can understand the complete picture, the greater the extent we can hope to have an effect in the areas that we can affect. There are many areas that are not really under our control, that are simply going to happen, they're going to play out at such a huge scale that individuals aren't going to be able to have much impact. But the better we understand the system, the more we can hope to do something about it, even if only in a relatively small way. And my view on the carbon tax is that it's going to end up being seen as part of the problem, unfortunately. If people are being squeezed for taxes all round and they just don't have any money anymore, then that carbon tax is going to be really unpopular, even among people who do accept climate change and the need to do something about it. So I think it's going to be one of those top-down solutions that is going to be very hard to keep in place, where it's going to be a question of somebody will find it cheap political points to whip up a mandate for getting rid of it. And so I think it's quite likely that they will get rid of it. So I don't look to a carbon tax as really being an effective solution under the circumstances, because I think it will be just too easy to remove it. And emissions will be falling anyway, simply because there's going to be less economic activity. I think we need to find other ways of affecting behavior in ways that will have an impact on climate and build it from the bottom up like everything else. So, no such thing as a short answer.
Yeah. Hi, Nicole. I've heard you talk the second time now, and thank you very much. It's been very enlightening.
Sorry, I can't quite hear you.
Try to work out this. Yeah, thanks for your talk. I heard it for the second time now. It's been very enlightening. And we've been discussing it at home a lot. And one of the things that I like to understand a little better for the financial preparation, there is, to me at least, and I think to a lot of other people, a trade-off between reducing the debt and staying liquid. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And so I realize I'm not sure if a small debt is better than a huge debt. So when I pay some of the debt off now, I end up being less liquid afterwards. Mm-hmm. So what's the advantage and what is the, well, I think what I'd like to understand better is the mechanics of the collateral grabbing, especially for houses and homes. Mm-hmm. So how does a bank think in that moment? Is it really better to have a small debt? Because I can't really get out of the debt completely.
It is a difficult balance. Some people are capable of having no debt and cash and control over the essentials of their own existence because they're just very wealthy people. The fewer resources you have, the harder choices you end up having to make. So people won't be able to do all of it. So that you end up with a number of possible choices. You can sell a property. If it's property-based debt, then you can sell a property. And then you typically get out of debt and have cash because you cash out the equity. So for some people, that will be the solution. That's the simplest solution. The other solution, if you have a relatively small amount of debt that may be manageable, you could think about, say, bringing in other income streams to help service the debt. So maybe have other people sharing the property, if it's a really good property. So if it's not, if it's a place that has a whole lot of vulnerabilities anyway, you're far better off selling it, especially if you have a large debt. But if it's a homestead, if it has, say, a lot of potential, you've perhaps put renewable energy systems in and you've set things up and it really is the right sort of place, it's somewhere you want to be stuck but you just can't do it with no debt, then you might need to think in terms of any way to bring in other income streams. So it might be possible to do it generationally within your own family. It might be possible to rent out a room or two. It might be possible to pool resources with friends, like-minded friends. So if you can find other income streams to service the debt, that can be ideal. One factor, though, if you can't get rid of the debt entirely, one factor to be aware of is that from the point of view of a bank, if it's thinking of foreclosing, then actually a property where there's a lot of equity may be a more attractive target for foreclosure than one that is underwater anyway. So if you can pay off quite a lot of debt, but you can't get rid of it all, then there may be a vulnerability there for the bank to say, oh, we'll have that one because we can sell that off and make sure we get all our money back and more besides maybe. So it is a very difficult decision to continue to own something when there is debt on it. And if you're going to do it, you'd want to make sure that you're really conservative about your ability to be able to service the debt. So think through, what would I do if the interest rates were 15% or 20%? Could I still pay this debt? And what would I do if the value of this property fell by 50%? 60, 70, 80%. Would I be underwater at that point? And what if I lost my job? How secure is my job? Is my job depression proof? Can I count on still having the job if I can count on having the job? What sort of income might I get under circumstances where unemployment is high and bargaining power is low? Because, quite frankly, even if you keep a job, salaries will fall because if an employer left your salary where it was in a deflationary period, that would be, in real terms, a salary increase because the money that you have would go further. Employers do not hand out salary increases under those circumstances, whether in nominal terms or in real terms. So salaries will definitely come down, but debt servicing payments will not. So if anything, they'll go up because interest rates go up. So you have to be really quite careful if you're going to continue to hold debt to make sure that you are more than capable of servicing the debt that is out there. You wouldn't want to get rid of all your liquidity, though. You're quite right that liquidity and getting out of debt are both important goals. You wouldn't want to pay down debt at the expense of having no liquidity whatsoever. That would be a very dangerous situation to be in. If there were bank holidays and things, you would be in trouble really, really quickly, more quickly for the lack of liquidity than you would over the amount of debt you would be carrying, quite likely. So there are a number of risk factors to think through. Don't have no liquidity at all.
Yeah, g'day, Alex Hindman. The 1930s went through a Great Depression, and economics developed an awful lot after that. So Keynes talks about how state governments or federal governments should step into the economy in slow times, and I think you can see that a lot of those lessons have been applied in the current GFC. Do you think that we haven't learnt enough about that, or what makes you think that the lessons we learnt from the Great Depression aren't sufficient to let us stumble through the GFC?
We didn't learn any lessons from the Great Depression. That's the problem. The problem is bubbles go back to antiquity. Every single time they happen, we utterly fail to recognize them. We do not learn the lessons of the last time. And I mean, this is because psychologically we don't want to see something as a bubble. We don't want to think that we're doing it all again. We tell ourselves stories that, no, it's different here. It's different this time. We can justify these valuations this time. So we tell ourselves that it's not a bubble, but it is. And we end up living through the exact same kind of consequences again. So history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it does rhyme. And if we don't learn the lessons of the past, then we are doomed to repeat those same experiences. And what they did in the Depression, really, they didn't provide a whole lot of liquidity into the system, but even if they had, as they are attempting to do in some places now, it's not really getting into the system, because the engine of fractional reserve banking is breaking down. So they're putting money into the banks that is then being put back on deposit at the central bank. It's not providing liquidity. So it's not whether or not the government is prepared to pony up money that really makes a difference. It's more the psychology of whether you have willing borrowers and lenders, whether any liquidity injections are getting out into the real economy where they can hope to have an effect. And what we're finding is that the liquidity injections that are going on this time are largely just being sterilized, so they're having no effect on the real economy. And I don't think there's any way that they can actually have an effect, because the psychology of deflation is really gripping. It's really powerful, and it generates very powerful self-fulfilling prophecies. If what they are doing is not addressing the cycle of fear, the crescendo of fear, then it will have no effect. And when what they do is always behind the curve, every time what they do fails to achieve the desired effect, it just makes them look more and more desperate and incompetent, and then it feeds the cycle of fear rather than diminishing it. If you look at, say, the interest rates in Greece, despite the Greek bailouts, it's gone like this. And all the bailouts, they buy you a bit of, a few days worth of optimism, and then the fear starts to build again. So even these large-scale bailouts are having virtually no effect, and they're just continuing to feed the cycle of fear. So I don't think there really is anything governments can do. Everything they do is too little, too late, and they simply can't keep pace with the rate of credit destruction when credit destruction really gets going, when it reaches a critical mass. Because credit has no physical reality, it can disappear from one day to the next. It can really disappear far more quickly than governments can attempt to do anything about it. So I don't think there really are any things that we can do at that kind of government level. To me, it's all going to be about ignore the government and do what we can for ourselves, because that is within the scope of what is possible.
Hi, thanks, Nicole. I'm feeling that I'm in a, well, certainly a vulnerable situation. I live in the outer suburbs, car dependent. Although I got the train here today, I'm a public servant, I have a small mortgage, and I have no practical skills. Anyway, another... No, there's lots of us, yes. A question along the lines of trade-offs. Is it worth increasing debt to borrowing money to have things done to meet essentials of life, so rainwater tanks, a wastewater treatment system, things I can't do myself or not easily. Is it worth actually borrowing money to do that?
On the whole, I don't think so. I think it's better to concentrate on the hard goods that are affordable. If you start borrowing, say, tens of thousands of dollars to put something in, you could just find that you lose it anyway because you end up so vulnerable over the level of debt that you end up underwater, you end up foreclosed on, and then the investment that you put in actually goes against you because mortgages are a recourse loan. If you're underwater and the property gets sold for less than you owe, they come after you for the difference. And part of that difference would be the investment you had put in to put, say, solar panels or rainwater systems in that now someone else is going to enjoy, but you still have to pay for. So you have to be very, very careful about going down that route. Far better to be as conservative as possible with financial management. Now, you might be able to do certain things communally. It depends on your neighborhood and your neighbors. So it might be possible to put in, say, a water tank that's jointly owned, that to some extent serves several properties that are close together, if you happen to be living near the right sort of people. So then you might be able to do it through pooling resources. Because if you can't afford to do it yourself, maybe you and several other people together can. Or maybe it could be solar panels or whatever else it might be. But for things that are larger, I would really be very wary of taking on debt to do it. I think that is going to be dangerous. It is going to put you in a vulnerable position, and you don't want to be any more vulnerable. A lot of people are vulnerable already. But actually, when it comes to things like practical skills, there's an awful lot you can learn. And you know, when you work in public service, one of the things that you tend to learn is some of the human skills, like organizing resources and perhaps mediation type skills. And you know, those human skills are going to be really important. It's not just whether or not you can swing a hammer or grow a tomato that's going to matter. The human skills are our software, if you like. And being able to just keep people together and in a positive mindset while helping to organize things at a local level could be a very important skill to offer. So it's really think through what you do have. Don't just look at what you don't have. There are going to be some obvious vulnerabilities for almost everybody. We can't all get rid of all our vulnerabilities. The world just doesn't work that way. I mean, we're not all billionaires. So we can identify our vulnerabilities. We're going to have to learn to live with them anyway and move forward. But then also think about what the strengths are, what you can genuinely do, and how you might use those strengths to best effect under some quite different circumstances. So do the balance on both sides. Don't just get terribly worried about the vulnerabilities. And if you can reduce vulnerabilities by pooling resources under some circumstances, then that can be a really useful approach.
Hi Nicole, my name is Simone. My question is about putting financial assets into cash. How long will that be good for, though, if the banks foreclose? Given the interconnectedness of banks anyway.
Well, banks are very, very vulnerable. They don't have 1% of the money that people have on deposit. So there's really actually very, very little there. They are very vulnerable to cash withdrawals. So you can expect cash withdrawals to get an awful lot harder over the next while. Banks don't hang on to a lot of cash. I mean, if you walked in and asked for a fairly large chunk of change, they wouldn't be able to give it to you unless you gave them quite a bit of notice. And certainly what's happening in Europe and the States is they're starting to put withdrawal limits on people to say, well, no, you can only take out a certain amount. And they're also bringing in requirements that you explain to them exactly why you want the money so that they can decide whether they think it's a legitimate reason or not. I mean, to which the answer should be, it's my money. You know? But nevertheless, they don't regard it as being your money. It's a debt owed to you by them, which they may or may not honor depending on the circumstances. And I think not will happen more often than it should. And a lot of the rules will end up probably being changed retroactively. So you could see loans being called in and all sorts of things that are currently not legal or not within the scope of the current contracts, but could nevertheless end up happening because the rules get changed all the time according to what happens to be convenient for the powers that be. I would definitely think of getting hold of a certain amount of cash. It doesn't have to be an awful lot. I try and suggest to people that perhaps a few months' worth would be useful if you could manage it, just in case there are bank holidays. So I would not regard money in the banking system as being secure, whatever guarantees are provided. Guarantees are only as good as the ability of the guarantor to meet the promise. And I would argue they simply do not have that ability, whatever they think. In terms of time frame for when you might expect to see bank holidays, I think it's a very, very difficult one. It's impossible to predict with any kind of accuracy. But what we are doing is looking at what's happening in Europe, and Europe could well go over the edge this year. So it depends how quickly the dominoes fall. It depends how rapidly the contagion spreads. But there is definitely a vulnerability because the global system is so interconnected, and the banks here are very vulnerable because they're dependent on asset values that are going to collapse because they are over-leveraged. Then they definitely are vulnerable to boat rocking incidents that come from abroad. And I think there are going to be substantial boat rocking incidents coming from, especially from Europe at the moment. We're already seeing capital flight in Europe. People are taking money out of banks in places like Greece, right, left, and center. And so it's already well underway. And of course, it's going to spread throughout the rest of the European periphery as well. And when you start to see problems in the banking system there, it could spread very quickly. So one of the things to watch is indicators like the London Interbank Offer Rate, the rate that banks charge each other to lend money for the very short term. What we saw in 2008 was those rates really spiked. In other words, the banking system was just freezing up. Banks knew what they had on their books. They were quite confident that the other guys weren't any better. So the whole interbank lending system started to seize up. And we actually came within a matter of hours of seizing up the global banking system in September 2008. So I think this time we probably won't get away with it. And it can happen really quickly because it's all electronic these days. And the big boys are engaging in electronic bank runs. So basically, it could be all over before the little guy even wakes up in the morning at some point. So you can be early, but you can't be late. So we really have to think about being prepared in advance, even if it means being prepared, say, a year or more in advance. It's better to be on the sidelines in cash than still in the grip of the system at a point where somebody, say, yells fire in a theater and everybody runs for the exit and not very many people actually get out. That's the risk if people stay invested in the system for too long, that they lose the opportunity to be able to extract themselves from it when it matters.
Hi, Nicole. My name is Jeff Tierfelder. I'm a big fan of your blog and a great talk today. Thanks for that. My question relates to, I guess, thinking about my own livelihood and how to potentially transition from a livelihood that I enjoy at the moment but may not be viable in the future. But that livelihood at the moment supports my lifestyle cost structure. Mm-hmm. And thinking about other livelihoods that at the moment may not support that, how do I actually transition to something that might be useful later but would be difficult to support my family on now?
That's a very good question because it's difficult. Basically, because it's hard to make a transition instantly, because as you say, the cost of your life they're fixed costs that if you lost the ability to service those now because you went to something that paid a lot less, then it would involve also an instant shift of lifestyle. Not everyone either wants to or can necessarily do that. Sometimes it is going to be a longer transition period. It can be difficult because when you try and have a foot in both worlds, you tend to end up with all the work of both and not all the benefits of either, which is a difficult situation to manage. It can be easier if you're not trying to do it by yourself. So I don't know if you have, say, a partner or a family or an extended family, but what you can do if there's more of you than just one is that, say, one of you or some of you can start to make the transition to things that are more where the future will be, while some stay in today's world and earn the living that funds the transition. So it's much, much harder. Like with everything else, it's much harder if you're trying to do it by yourself. It tends to be a lot of work, and then you end up really quite exhausted, and it's not like you can really enjoy the benefits of the new life you might be moving towards. So if there's any way you can do it with other people, then that will be easier. But there are things you can do. I mean, the facilitator training that Shani offers, and the Living Smart courses, and there are a lot of things where you can learn a lot, even if you don't really have the time to put it all into practice in advance. You can be learning at least the theoretical basis for the skills. You can be preparing yourself psychologically. You can be engaging more with society so that you're building the relationships of trust, even if you can't prepare physically as much as you would like beforehand. It's not that there's nothing you can do.
Thank you. Susanna, we've got time for your question. For those people who are on the list, please, who's been at an open space before? Who's participated in open space before? Okay. I want you to imagine a cocktail party with really brainy, great people at it. Okay? And basically, during the open space, you're going to get to wander around and ask the questions of the people that you'd like to ask, whether it be Nicole or somebody else. Have the conversations that you want to have. So for those 20 people that are still on the list that had questions, please do hang around after lunch. We'll have a short lunch. We'll try and make it about half an hour. And then we'll come back in here. Nicole will still be here. She won't go anywhere. I am asking that people leave her alone for lunch, if we could, so she can have a bit of a break. But please stay for the afternoon for that open space session. Thank you.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you. Just a brief and quick one. Is one of the things to prepare you? There was a mention of time banks. What are time banks? I've got no idea.
A time bank is basically a roster of hours contributed without the need for exchanging money. So you say, well, what sort of skills can I offer? Maybe I'm a dentist, so I'll fix your teeth in exchange for whatever it is you can do for me. And systems like that tend to work best if an hour is an hour is an hour. In other words, an hour of your time is worth an hour of somebody else's, no matter what both of you do. Because if you start to try and build in differentials where you say, well, I'm a dentist, so my time is worth 10 times as much as yours, and you're digging holes or something like that. No, it really doesn't work if you do it on that kind of basis, because no one's ever going to agree on what the differentials ought to be, and all it does is breed resentment anyway, and it creates a system that reflects the current hierarchy in ways that are unhelpful. It keeps you pinned in a hierarchy that's not going to be sustained. So if we just look at changing an hour for an hour, whatever everybody does, then you're just keeping track of that. You have a roster online or something like that where people put hours in to the system, and then they can withdraw hours out. And it's not like you necessarily have to exchange with the same person. If there's a time bank and a sort of pooled number of hours, you may be able to give a certain number of hours to someone over here, and then ask for a certain number of hours from somewhere over there. So it allows it to be more complicated than just a barter system, just a direct kind of exchange. So it allows you to scale it up to some extent. It's never going to be a large-scale thing, but it can be community-wide. So it's something where if you identify the skills people have and you encourage people to trade those skills, you're simply less dependent on having to have money, and you can still get things done that you would need to get done. So it's a way of sort of future-proofing, if you like, getting out from under the dependence on money. And that's going to be critical. I mean, there's a really interesting essay by Dmitry Orlov, actually. He was writing about the Soviet Union compared to the United States. And he's Russian, but he grew up in America and spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union when it was collapsing. One of the factors that he really points to as being a critical reason why the Soviet collapse was less painful than it will be in America is that in the Soviet Union you didn't have to have any money. You didn't have to pay rent. You didn't have to pay utilities. The state told you where to live. You went and lived there, and just because you didn't have any money didn't mean that you were going to get thrown out on the street or have your utilities cut off. So even although the state stopped paying people, they were being paid months late, if at all, they still went to work. They didn't really have anything better to do, so society kept ticking over. In societies where everything is critically dependent on the exchange of money for so many things, that is a real vulnerability, because you take the money out of the system and everything stops functioning right away. So time banks are a useful way, so are local currencies. Time banks are a useful way of trying to get out from under that particular vulnerability so that you don't end up with the potential for things to just seize up almost immediately.
We time banked lunch today.